Hello BookTube, FFS, February Fantasy Stories is returning. February Fantasy Stories is a month-long reading project reading event created by the Bookish Bryants, in which participants read fantasy in the month of February. This year, the Bookish Bryants are bowing out of FFS, and Steve Donahue is stepping in to host the event this year. There are, and I'll leave links to both the Bookish Bryants' YouTube channel as well as Steve Donahue's announcement for FFS. So there are 4 weekly prompts. The first week is Sword and Sorcery, the second is Epic Fantasy, the third is Contemporary, and I think the fourth is in a series, which fantasy is very prone to do. Fantasy is and has been for a long time my favorite genre of fiction, although I normally pair it with science fiction. But over the past few years, my interest in fantasy, my enjoyment of fantasy has waned. But I keep hoping that I'll find a book that will get me back into reading fantasy more enthusiastically. And so maybe February Fantasy Stories will help me. In addition to all of the other reading I have planned for February, a lot of it will be history heavy. I'm rather annoyed that I did not read as much history in January as I would have liked, but yeah, I'm going to make up for it in February. But I do have some works of fantasy that I will be reading. Now, as happenstance would have it, I do have a number of reading projects that do include works of fantasy. So first up is my 10 contemporary classics I must bill redeem. It's a few months ago, well, still about a month ago, or a little more than a month ago, Katie Books created a triptych of videos in which he listed 10 classics, one before 1900, the second but from 1900 to 1999, and the third since 2000, in which he listed 10 classics from those eras, even though one of which is millennia long, that he thinks you must read. A number of other booktubers have since gotten involved, myself included. But I had some trouble with the contemporary classics, the since 2000. And then I watched Steve Donahue's version, and while I agree with him on Perdita Street Station by China Miéville, which is a work of new weird, it's a sort of a mashup of, or variation in a way on steampunk, but anyway. But there were 3 others on Steve's list, that I have bailed on. And that got me thinking about 10 contemporary classics that I must redeem. So I searched for 7 candidates for contemporary classics that I have previously bailed on. I have not redeemed them yet, and so far they're not being redeemed, but the year is still young. So I was thinking of a very popular work of fantasy that I had previously bailed on that I think could be a candidate for this little project, and that led me to Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. This is a massive novel that's it's not exactly steampunk. It's set in an alternate 19th century Britain, in which Kingdom of Fairy exists within the United Kingdom. I read it, or had a go at it, I really should say, ages ago, and quickly bailed on it. But I've wanted to have another go at it since, and this project is a perfect time to have a go at it. And I was originally going to read this in March as part of my March of the Mammoth project. But I'm moving it up to February Fantasy Story, so hopefully I will have better success this time than the last time. Now I also have another project called my 12 TBR, in which I selected 12 books. Originally was half fiction, half history, but since Historathon happened, I moved those 6 works of history to Historathon, and then selected 6 more works of fiction, of which half are realistic and half are fantasy. And so with the idea of reading some newer works that I've added to my collection, as well as older works, which would mostly encompass the fantasy, since I really haven't picked up any new fantasy since Moonwitch Spider King by Marlon James, which perhaps I really should get to too. But anyway, so originally what my plan was to pair a more realistic novel with a fantasy. But I think I'm going to change that this month and instead do 2 works of fantasy. So my original plan was to focus on The Forgetting Moon by Brian Lee Durfee as my fantasy reading for February. This is the first volume in the Five Warrior Angels series, and I don't really know much about it, except I think it's grimdark and very low on the magic, which might be a problem because I really like the magic. But I've heard a number of great things about it, so I'm optimistic. And I think to sort of add to the fantasy, I will be reading 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City by K.J. Parker. I'm going to say this is a more humorous fantasy in which a character tries to save a city or something. I will report back as I read it. So that is my fantasy reading plans for There Goes Jonathan Strange. So this is my fantasy reading plans for February. Wish me luck. I might need it. So in your booktube, I might do another video in which I talk about my wider February reading plans, or I might just let that to chance. I don't know. But it will probably be very history-centric, since there are at least 4 works of history that I do want to get to in February, if not more. So in your booktube, I will see you tomorrow with part 2 of my 2023 library tour. Again, it will encompass my writing and art books, and I will be back also later that evening with a tag video. Not an original one, but one that I've seen making the rounds. So in a booktube until then, thank you, have a great afternoon, and stay safe.